Do you ever wonder how long you really need to spend on a piece of music before moving on to something new? For example, do you really need to play something perfectly first? Or is it okay to play it mostly well and then move on to the next thing? And then, if you can play your piece well, how long do you really need to stick with it before replacing it with new material? Well, after having taught well over 20,000 lessons and having played professionally for over 20 years, I have figured out an answer to this question. And today, I want to talk to you about 3 main factors that you really need to consider when deciding if and when it's time to move on to new material. Factor number 1 has to do with your current level of expertise. The first thing you want to do is figure out where you are. So on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being a complete beginner and 10 being a virtuoso, first figure out where you are on that spectrum. Now, it doesn't have to be an exact number. You can pick a short range. For example, I consider myself to be somewhere between a 6 and an 8. Pretty decent, but I'm still trying to get better to have some room to grow. Now, this may be a shocker, but the closer you are to a 1, the less important it is and the less you need to worry about mastering new material before moving on to something new. I know that may sound crazy. You would think that if you're starting something from scratch, you want to do everything perfectly so that you build a strong foundation from which to grow. But the truth is that the brain does not seem to work that way when we're learning new motor skills, according to research. In an awesome study that was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science and Sports, researchers tested 2 groups of kids on throwing accuracy, form, and technique to figure out this whole thing. And in that study, they had kids throwing beanbags into a target that was 5 meters away, which is, by the way, 16.4 feet. First thing that the researchers did was establish a baseline. And they did that by having both groups of kids throw the beanbags at a small target that was 5 meters away. And then each group practiced using 2 different schedules of progressive difficulty. And by the end of the study, each group was tested again on that same small target, once again at 5 meters away, just to see how much they improved from the beginning to the end. Group 1 was called the error-reduced group, where their difficulty level increased as time went on. In the first week of practice, for example, they were given a large and very easy target that was 2.4 meters squared. That's 25.8 feet squared, by the way. On the second week, the target size was almost reduced to half. It was 1.1 meters squared. That's 11.8 feet squared. And then finally, on the third week, the target was reduced even more to 0.45 meters squared, which is 4.8 feet squared. So basically, they started with a large and easy target, and they ended the practice with a small and more challenging target. Group 2 was called the error-strewn group, and they practiced in reverse order of difficulty. They started with the smallest target, more challenging, and then they ended with the largest and easiest target in their third week. A week later, so 4th week now, both groups were then tested once again for accuracy, throwing form, and technique on that smallest target, which is 0.45 meters square, again at 5 meters away. And what the researchers found was that the error-reduced group significantly outperformed the error-strewn group in all 3 measures. So the group that started with the easy target outperformed the group that started with the small target and harder target. Now, I found this study on performance psychologist Noah Kageyama's website, which, by the way, I will have a link to in the description below, so make sure to check that out. And Kageyama says that these results could potentially be attributed to 2 factors. One of them is that when we start with easier goals, we have a lot more room for exploration, a lot more room for errors and corrections. We can use more muscle groups. One way I like to think of this is maybe think about like you're throwing darts. If you're throwing darts and you're in a room where the walls are almost pressed up against your arms, you can only really kind of throw like that, right? So you don't have a lot of room for exploration. But if you're in a room like this, where you can wind up and throw and then you miss, you can adjust your throwing a little bit more. It gives us a lot more room to nudge our technique to get to where we want to go. The second factor that Kageyama attributes, says could be an attributing factor to this, has to do with success rate. So if you start with something easier and you succeed, you're likely going to build confidence, right? And if you build confidence, you're going to build more motivation. At the same time, your skill is improving. So when you get another goal that's slightly harder, you're already going into it with a higher level of motivation, a higher level of confidence, and of course your skill will already have improved. And those 3 things continue to snowball, again, as long as you're successful most of the time. So the bottom line is that if you're working on new material, and by the way, this is especially true if you're a beginner, you really want to make sure to start with easy material first. Don't do what I did. I tried to play Paco de Lucia material. I tried to play Recuerdos de la Alhambra because I thought they were beautiful. And I ended up having to take 1,000 steps back to try to correct all the problems that I made and then reset with easier material. my opinion, is that when you're working on that easy material, you want to go for around a 70 to 85% success rate initially for both the errors that you uncover and discover in the music, and then your entire musical passage. Once you reach your goal, that 70 to 85% success rate, once again, this is my opinion, I think it's generally okay to move on to the next item. And then when you do move on, you can reinforce your newly gained skill, your confidence, motivation, etc. by continuously going for around that 70 to 85% initial success rate, once again in the early stages of your musical development. Now, as your skill improves, I still think you should start any new material within that range, 70 to 85% success, and then progressively increase your success rate before moving on to something new. And I think that's more important as you get better. But knowing when to move on, it also depends on factor number 2, which is the difficulty level of your music. What I found, once again, in over 20 years of teaching and then my own experience as a student, is that in general, you should be able to learn a short passage of music and be able to play that passage slowly, correctly, and from memory in one 30 to 45 minute practice session. And by short passage, I really mean a short passage anywhere from 1 to 4 measures long, or if you're working from an audio or video source, think about it as something from 4 to 10 seconds of music long. Very, very short. If you find that you are unable to get your music memorized, slow, correct in that time, then it's likely the case that the passage you're working on is just too difficult for you right now. And then if that's the case, that's totally fine. But I would generally recommend abandoning that and moving on to something easier. If you're unsure, I highly recommend reaching out to a qualified teacher or a music coach, somebody that can help you assess both your music's difficulty and your current level of expertise so that they can make precise recommendations for you. Now, what if your music's too easy? If it is, and you find yourself playing an entire passage of music mostly correct, like 90 to 100% success rate in one practice session, then the decision to move on really comes down to factor number 3, which has to do with your musical goals. Your musical goals are a combination of how much you like the music that you're working on, what your goals are in terms of your technique, like how good do you want your technique to be, and what your goals are in terms of your musical expression, right? How interesting or musical do you want it to sound? The first thing you want to do is rate how much you like your piece of music. On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being either you hate it completely or maybe it's the most boring thing in the world, and then 10 being this is absolutely beautiful, everybody has to listen to it. Rate your music just literally on pure aesthetics, because the truth is that if you don't like a piece very much, then you're probably not going to be very motivated to work on it, at least not very long, right? And this is, unfortunately, this is very common in our early stages of learning, the beginner stages and the early intermediate stages. We run into a lot of exercises like that. Single notes, kind of boring, simple stuff, not terribly motivating. When this happens, my personal preference and recommendation is to go for that 70 to 85% success rate for the entire passage, maybe the exercise or the piece in general, and then spend the majority of my time working on overcoming or improving only the challenges that you identified in your music. When I don't particularly like an exercise or a piece of music, I use those challenges, or those challenge spots as I like to call them, as essentially workout tools to improve both my technique and musicality. And then I don't really waste my time playing the rest of the passage or piece that maybe I can play pretty well, 70 to 85% well, but I don't really like too much. Like I said before, this is only my opinion. It is based on over 20 years of teaching and my own experience, but it is my opinion. There's no empirical data out there on this. I feel that in the early stages of musical development, it's okay to move on after you reach around that 70 to 85% success rate. Now, if you're at an intermediate or advanced level, then I do think it's still important to start within that range, 70 to 85% success. But then it's more important to go for as high a success rate as possible progressively, just for the identified challenges. Again, just to be clear, what I'm talking about right now is music that you do not like, but you do see the benefits of spending time working on those challenges that you discovered in your music so that you can improve. All right, what if you do like the music? Well, if that's the case, if you do like the music you're working on, then you have to ask yourself what your goals are in terms of technique, memorization, and musical expression. Now, whether you're just playing for fun or you're playing professionally, I think it's important to ask yourself, are you happy playing pretty well, but maybe not great? Or do you want to play the music you're working on beautifully, right? If I really like a piece of music and it's at my level or maybe a bit easier or even ever so slightly above it, then my personal goal is to squeeze as much as I can out of that piece of music for both enjoyment and improvement purposes. So I will spend a lot more time on that piece of music because I like it and I find it motivating in order to reach my goals. Now, when this is the case, so when you do like a piece of music, what I found is that it generally takes most students anywhere from 1 to 12 months. I know that's a big range. I'll explain that in a second, but 1 to 12 months to get a piece of music from 0 to a performance level. And of course, that depends heavily on the complexity of the music, on the length of the music, and then of course on your current level of expertise. For example, if you've got a one-pager at or below your level, then it should take you roughly about a month to get that piece to a performance level. This is assuming that you're practicing 3 to 6 days a week consistently and spending around 30 to 60 minutes of practice on that piece each day. Okay? If you find that it's taking you significantly longer than a month to do that, then you could be doing something wrong in practice. And in that case, I would highly recommend reaching out once again to a qualified teacher or a music coach to help you out, figure out what you're doing wrong. Because the last thing you want to do is ingrain bad habits, practice habits. You don't want to waste your time practicing in inefficient manners, right? You want to make sure you're doing everything correctly. I mean, having a coach is what gets most experts to that next level. Athletes have coaches on an almost daily basis, and of course, it's obvious that they benefit tremendously from this. Like I mentioned before, I have taught for over 20 years professionally, performed professionally. I would be honored to be your music coach if that's something that you're looking for classical or flamenco guitar. If it is, I will have a link to my program in the description below. Check it out. You can apply. We can chat about your goals. Now, there's one thing that is very important. I mentioned many times in this video that one excellent starting point for deciding whether or not to move on is to aim for that 70 to 85% success rate in practice. Now, these numbers are not arbitrary. There is preliminary research on motor skills that suggests that a 70 to 85% success rate is really the key for fastest improvement in the initial stages of learning something. It is very, very important for you to understand how to implement that 70 to 85% success rate strategy in your repetitions and really in your practice in general. So if you want to make sure you're doing that right, you're practicing correctly, then definitely check out the next video on the screen where I show you exactly how to do this.